You're listening to The Conversation. To the north of Rio de Janeiro, near the international airport, lie the sprawling favelas of Alemão and Penha. These neighbourhoods, crisscrossed with low-hanging electricity cables, are a vast jumble of houses and informal settlements, often with a bright blue water storage tank on the roof. The state is largely absent here, and there are limited public services. Instead, guns, drugs, and crime are a part of daily life. Skirmishes with the police are frequent, but a police raid on the 28th of October was on a different scale. As dawn breaks, residents in Alemão and Penha are woken by the sound of gun battles.
2,500 security agents stormed two large favelas, or slums.
In the days that follow, it emerges that at least 115 civilians and 4 police officers died in the raid, making it one of the deadliest police operations in Brazilian history.
Line up on a main road of Complexo de Penha, one of Rio's largest favelas. These residents lay out the lifeless bodies of their neighbors.
Police were targeting the Commando Vermelho, or the Red Command, one of Latin America's most powerful criminal organizations. But the operation on the 28th of October sparked allegations of extrajudicial killings and questions about whether these heavy-handed tactics actually work to tackle organised crime, or whether they make the problem even worse. And the raid comes at an embarrassing time for Brazil as it prepares to host world leaders and thousands of delegates for the COP30 climate summit. In this episode, we ask, how did organised crime become so deeply embedded in Brazil? And is there a better way to confront it?
What you've seen over the past decade in particular is the penetration of organized crime into not just new geographic areas, but entirely new sectors of the economy.
I'm Gemma Ware from The Conversation, an independent news and analysis platform partnering journalists with academics. Welcome to The Conversation Weekly, where experts explain how we ended up here. Robert Mugger, you're the Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow at the Bosch Academy and co-founder of the Institute Igarape, a research institute in Rio de Janeiro. You're Canadian, but you've lived in Brazil for 15 years and have done extensive research on organised crime in the country. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Robert, how did you first become aware that a huge police operation had begun on the 28th of October in Rio?
Well, I live in Rio, and I could literally hear the rippling crackle of gunfire, as one often does, unfortunately, in Rio, cascading through the city. And I live in the center of the city, and this operation was happening in the north zone. But you could see thin plumes of smoke rising above the horizon from my apartment. And I think most importantly, and again, it's a common sound in Rio, is the sound of the wail of police sirens that cut through the city. The other way I learned, as we often do today, was this palpable sense of panic on social media. So immediately I was inundated with messages of this mega operation, and it was ricocheting across my WhatsApp groups. And then the third way I found out was that my school for my child called, indicating that parents should come quickly and pick up their children. And then we were told later in the evening that the school was suspended. And I suppose the thing to stress here is that this kind of disruption, whether it's gunfire or whether it's police and ambulance sirens or whether it's messages from schools, is really quite routine here in Rio. Over the last 15 years, I think every year there have been incidents, albeit not on this scale, but there have been police incursions. In fact, earlier this year, I was sitting on my balcony and 3 helicopters passed within a few hundred meters of the apartment, with their weapons trained on the apartments and the forest in the backyard. And by the evening, after I'd seen those helicopters, 15 people had been killed just next door. I understand how these challenges are often very pointedly focused on lower income areas, what we call favelas in Brazil, almost always targeting poor Black populations. But, even with every episode, I think it's important we don't become inured to this sort of daily violence. And unfortunately, that's what's happened here in Brazil. A poll came out 2 days after the raids by the police in these 2 neighborhoods, and it said that 55% of all Brazilians emphatically supported this raid, 62% of residents of Rio supported the raid, and 80% of those living in favelas supported the raid. So despite the horrific images, the extraordinary disruption, the majority of Brazilians tend to support a tough-on-crime approach.
So the raid was targeting a gang called the Commando Vermelho, or Red Command, which is one of the oldest criminal gangs in Brazil. It's been around since the early 1970s. Take me back. How was this gang founded?
So Commando Vermelho, like so many other criminal factions and organizations across Latin America, was actually born in the prison rather than the street. Going back to the 1970s, which was during Brazil's military dictatorship, which ran from 1964 to 1985, the authorities at the time often would crowd common criminals together with left-wing political prisoners in the same jails. And there was a particular jail called Candido Mendes in an island called the Big Island, Ilha Grande, which is a few hours south of Rio, where the commando was born. And at the time, in the early 1970s, as today, inmates in these prisons, and in this prison in particular, faced really brutal conditions, almost medieval conditions. And so what would happen is that these inmates would organize for their own protection against repressive penitentiary officials or against other factions. And what you had was an interesting fusion of the political prisoners' ideas of solidarity and collective discipline, many of whom themselves were involved in sort of low-grade insurgencies before being imprisoned, with the kind of street smarts and the skills and the networks of the criminals. So you had this metastasis happening between these different inmates. And what you had in the early 70s was an alliance that emerged from these two groups called the Falange Vermelha, which means the Red Phalanx. And in the late 1970s, it evolved into what we now know as the Commando Vermelho.
Was there a moment when it moved out of the prisons and into the street?
What happened was, as these groups incubated inside the prisons, inmates were often transferred to other prisons for a variety of reasons, or inmates were released after serving their term. And the members of the Commando Vermelho would carry a kind of code and a set of practices onto the street and into the favelas. So by the 1980s, what you have is a fairly well-organized group, which is diversifying its income streams from what was typically bank robberies or targeted raids to the cocaine economy, which was exploding. That's when Americans discover a taste for cocaine. Cocaine isn't produced in Brazil. It's produced in countries neighboring Brazil, notably Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. But Brazil is a thoroughfare for cocaine that is transshipped towards Europe or upwards north through the Caribbean to the United States. And I think the Commando Vermelho, like so many other organized crime groups around the world, recognized that the cocaine trade offered a rather higher margin than bank robberies. The leadership were very quick to understand that this was going to be their future. And so what you had was Rio becoming a kind of way station for the movement of cocaine, but also an area where people would consume, because Rio's a city of tourists. Rio's a city of the well-heeled. There was a lot of money in Rio.
At some point, they broke away from their relationship with the left-wing guerrillas. When did it become more of an organized criminal gang rather than this alliance with the left-wing elements?
It's hard to exactly say, because I think what you have in those early years, as you did in every other country where you have a dictatorship, was some kind of armed opposition. It wasn't as violent as what you saw, say, in Chile or Argentina. Not as many people were killed by the state, though many hundreds were, and disappearances occurred with great frequency. But on the street, certainly throughout the 60s and 70s, you have a series of attacks by the left-wing guerrillas against the military authorities. And in order to finance their operations, it wasn't just sympathetic people at the left. They had to generate revenue. And so I think you saw the guerrillas using ostensibly criminal tactics to be able to finance their campaign. In some cases under the rubric of the Red Command up until about the latter half of the 70s. But I think you start seeing them shed their left-wing ideologies fairly quickly, especially as the cocaine trade starts kicking in, which is really the early 80s.
So they moved out of prisons and then they concentrated their activities in two particular neighborhoods in Rio, the Complexo de Alemão and Penha, which are these two neighborhoods that have been targeted in this most recent raid. What is the modus operandi in these neighborhoods as they expanded?
So the first thing I'd say is the CV doesn't just move into Alemão or Penha. They actually move into many communities. And there are hundreds of favelas in Rio de Janeiro. I think Alemão and Penha today are just happen to be one of the strongholds. Another big stronghold is called Rocinha, Brazil's most well-known informal settlement or favela. Some say as much as 20 to 30% of the city is effectively under the control of the Commando Vermelho. You have the prisons effectively acting as command hubs, the neighborhoods providing a kind of retail distribution site. So you have these locations in different neighborhoods where the Commando Vermelho is present, called the Boca de Fumos, which is where you go pick up your drugs. And I think it's important to understand they don't operate necessarily like a rigid pyramid. I think people have in their minds when they think about drug factions, a kind of cartel-like structure that all groups follow that structure. They actually align in very almost autonomous crews that each hold different territory, and then they distribute these drugs locally or they transshipment off towards ports. And what these different groups do, whether it's at Alemão or Penha or whether it's elsewhere, is that they enforce these rules of behavior, codes of conduct, often ruthlessly. If you transgress rules, there are grave punishments, including death. They collect taxes informally. They adjudicate disputes, and they prey on residents. And it's quite effective because almost by definition, these informal settlements lack formal institutions. And so they, in a way, provide those institutions to keep things running. And so they're, in a way, substituting for a weak or even absent state service. And so this model in the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s proved fairly durable. And today it's amongst the top two most dominant, resilient criminal factions in Brazil. The other one being the PCC, the Primary First Command, which is a Sao Paulo-based faction. These organizations have adopted and adapted and evolved, and I think are run a bit like almost multinational corporations today. So these are sophisticated operations. And today, the CV is estimated to have about 30,000 recruits, not just in Rio, but spread across Rio State, which is a state of about 15 million people. And it's present in all 26 states, including the Federal Cabo. And also, they've pushed into the Amazon and beyond. It's also present in most of the countries in the region, Paraguay, Uruguay, Bolivia, Peru, Colombia. And it even has representation in North America and Western Europe. So it's a formidable organization, but it's very territorially moored in Rio.
And I wondered, organised crime has been in Brazil for decades, as you've explained, but has it got worse in recent years? Why are these groups being able to now move with franchises into the Amazon or inland? What's actually allowing them to flourish more at this moment than they have been?
I think there's a couple of factors that really explain why they've been able to expand. And the first is that the footprint of organized crime, including the CV, has expanded and diversified even, and the story is a little complex, as overall homicide rates have declined over the last 15, 20 years. And part of that is because I think that the criminal organizations are in a way consolidating their control. You know, when they're able to come to certain arrangements and bargains with each other and or with the state, notwithstanding these periodic mega operations, they come into a kind of equilibrium. And equilibrium generally reduces violence. It's when you have disequilibrium and a competition between gangs and between the state where you tend to see violence rates spike. And so what you've seen over the past decade in particular is the penetration of organized crime, including the CV, into not just new geographic areas, but entirely new sectors of the economy. Not just drugs, but now we've got organized crime involved in gold mining, selective logging, wildlife trafficking, cybercrime, even into fintech. And it's this expansion diversification of organized crime aligned with, you could almost argue, the expansion diversification of globalization, the expansion of the capabilities and the forces that are connected to these groups. We've seen this sharp rise of the CV in the Amazon. We've seen them getting more and more involved in environmental crimes. So I think organized crime is evolving and adapting to contemporary modern markets. And, you know, we've even seen groups like the CV getting involved into oil tapping and into stealing petrol from refineries and even operating a whole entire shadow petrol station market and then laundering the funds, not necessarily into the local hairdresser or the local mechanic, which has typically been the old way, but into large investment funds and into fintech. The other reason I think these groups are able to expand and consolidate is because they have an ample supply of firearms. Brazil is the third largest producer of small arms and light weapons and ammunition in the world. The CV's also tapped into international markets for firearms, including from the United States. And survey after survey of the weapons that are seized in these operations suggests that the vast majority, upwards 70, sometimes as much as 90% of the weapons are coming from the United States.
What is the impact of this infiltration of organized crime on ordinary Brazilians?
So for ordinary Brazilians, what these high levels of violence mean and what these periodic fights mean between gangs is obviously a sense of personal risk, real genuine sense of being targeted or hit indirectly in the crossfire, a concern with curfews, so impacts their everyday mobility. People often are routinely getting robbed. I think for a lot of people, there's also a higher exposure to everyday assaults, extortion, intimidation. It permeates every aspect of people's lives. And this is why it's translated into being the number one issue for Brazilians today in the polls. It also has a real impact on the economy. It's a drag on costs of living. I think it has cascading effects into everyday prices for consumers. And then it has, I think, really corrosive impacts on people's faith in institutions. And when states are unable to deliver durable safety and security, this feeds a deep well of frustration and a search for quick solutions. And what we're seeing in Brazil, as we've seen in so many other countries around the world, is that this also exacerbates polarization. And so those on the far right who can offer heavy-handed, heavy-fisted, what we call a mano dura solution, often can win electoral gains from this sense of insecurity. The left, which hasn't really provided a very satisfactory answer, I think, to the security dilemma, often treating it as a symptom of underlying structural issues like poverty and inequality and racism and human rights violations, all of which is true. That isn't satisfying, I think, for everyday citizens who are victimized at least once a year or routinely feeling insecure in their daily activities. So I think that this high levels of violence feeds this sense of frustration with the state. It undermines people's sense of faith in democracies and trust in politicians and public institutions. So all of this is quite perilous, I think, for democracies in Latin America, not just in Brazil.
Coming up, why did the raid on the Red Command happen now? And how effective are operations like these at really tackling organised crime? That's after this short break.
Hi, I'm Anna Walker, host of a new podcast called Jane Austen's Paper Trail from The Conversation. From a scandal-filled bun shop in Bath to a windswept walk along the Cobb in Lyme Regis, and even a glittering Regency ball, we've travelled around England to bring Jane Austen's world to life through interviews with today's foremost Austen experts. Listen to Jane Austen's Paper Trail wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, it's Liv Little.
It's Miranda Sawyer here, and we are the hosts of the newest culture podcast out there. We have notes from The Observer.
As writers, we give and take notes all the time. It's part of the fun, especially when it comes to culture. But now we're sharing our thoughts on the most interesting stories dominating the zeitgeist.
No headline skimming here. We promise to give you the insightful takes, plenty of debate, and a recommendation or two.
Listen to new episodes of We Have Notes every Wednesday, wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. Robert, the 28th of October operation was the result of around a year of planning, but it appears that the federal government wasn't aware of it, and the president of Brazil condemned the violence in the days that followed.
O presidente Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva afirmou que a mega operação
Speaking before international correspondents, the Brazilian leader denounced what he called a massacre.
Can you walk me through why the police in Rio decided to react in this way to this raid? Like, what were the politics of this?
So public security in Rio and in Brazil is heavily politicized. And the raid of October 28th is no exception. It occurred in a highly polarized environment where state governments, who have the constitutional responsibility for delivering public security, are also pushing for more autonomy in delivering solutions. So what happened in Rio within hours of the raid was that the state governor, who is a right-wing governor, Governor Castro, moved immediately to claim success, despite the stories emerging of upwards of 130 deaths. many injured and many others disappeared. He quickly claimed success for this operation. He rapidly criticized the feds for not having provided sufficient support, despite the feds claiming they weren't even aware the operation was going to take place. And they gathered other right-leaning governors together in a public show of solidarity and resolve to announce the formation of a coalition for peace of right-wing mayors. This was a message both of support for Rio by these right-leaning governors that they endorsed this heavy-handed approach, but was also a message back to Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, that they ought not to overly interfere in the autonomy of governors in delivering their solutions that their publics are demanding. And the federal government were, I would say, not as vocal in responding to this provocation. Lula himself, while condemning the violence, did not outwardly condemn the governor who sits in another party, I think with an eye on the polls. We have an election here in a year, and responded quite cautiously. And I think the reason is that the feds understand that these kinds of operations are actually immensely popular. So the operations taking place in this tense environment as we approach a national election in 2026, next year. And I think what it shows us is that the right, in this case, the governor of Rio, is advancing a simple message based on toughness and deterrence, and the left is emphasizing more legality and prevention and human rights, and that the right now is winning in the war of narratives.
And you mentioned there was a poll that was carried out 2 days after the raid, which indicated that 62% of Rio residents supported the operation. But there have also been protests in the favelas, in the areas that were targeted. So there isn't just a unified view in Rio that this was the right approach.
Absolutely. After every raid, mothers are on the streets. NGOs and civil society groups are expressing outrage and protest. Favela organizations and networks are denouncing the violence. Public defenders are coming out with strong statements. The UN human rights advisory bodies have also issued statements of concern.
Human rights groups have also voiced concern over the growing number of deadly police operations.
There is always an outcry, and yet what happens very quickly is that those voices are suffocated by strong narratives of the right, by the elite, even by much of the middle class, who are much less sympathetic. This is a story of Brazil and a story of Latin America, that the violence is often externalized on those with the least means to express their voice, those who are the poorest, those who are at the edges and periphery of society. This October 28th, I think, may be a little different, given just the sheer scale of the death toll. I think news is still coming out about what exactly happened in those areas. Many of the bodies that were there were defaced. Some were, and apologies for getting graphic here, but there were reports of some beheadings of bodies cut up by the police. There are allegations, of course, that are still being investigated, not just the scale, but the nature of the violence and the excessive nature of it and the extrajudicial nature of some of the violence, I think will result in a whole range of investigations that are still going to be ongoing. So this story is not over.
And do these heavy-handed operations like that on the 28th of October actually have any material effects on the operations of a gang like CV, the Red Command?
Yeah, I think these raids frequently generate headlines and periodically a brief dip in violence, but they very rarely lead to anything like a lasting stability. And in some cases, what they might even do after a short lull is see spikes in violence as we see retribution from the gang against the police and or others who may have been sympathetic to the police. And as a result, may even strengthen criminal organizations. And this is the big paradox of these tough on crime strategies, that not only do they often fail, they actually may do the reverse. They may, in fact, increase the strength and control and influence of these organized crime groups.
So what would be a better approach then to tackling organized crime?
I think it comes in stages. The first thing we have to think about is recovering territory in a way that's more permanent, and often with more of a community face. And there have been attempts around more community-oriented policing, but a place-based approach that offers not just policing, but offers some kind of meaningful substitution for services that provide certain kinds of benefits. And that is, I think, a precondition. The second thing you need is intelligence-led policing, which means you need to be able to identify who it is exactly you're going after. I'm not saying that this operation didn't have some of that. They'd planned it for a year, for goodness sakes, but they didn't even get the main guy they're going after. Surprise, surprise. The third thing you need is prevention. And we know this. It's investment in programs and activities that reinforce education for young kids and keeps them in the schools. You need interventions that are focused on what we call cognitive behavioral therapy, dealing with kids who need to vision a more positive future. You need parent mentoring programs, because a lot of these kids who get involved in the gangs come from single parent households or come from very difficult, extreme, challenging backgrounds. And then I think perhaps almost most importantly, you need to go after the money. And it's only if you start turning off the spigot, shutting down the supply chains that are driving the revenues for these crime groups, working with the tax authorities, the central banks, the financial crimes units, to actually understand how the cash is being laundered, that you're actually going to squeeze these groups off. And the good news is a couple of months ago in August, we had a spectacular raid on the PCC in Sao Paulo, where the feds and the state were involved in a joint operation going after the money supply of the PCC. And they found that there were billions of dollars worth of illegal profits being cycled into legitimate financial institutions, banks and asset management companies and fintech companies. And it was through a long and painstaking but incredibly well-organized, targeted campaign, intelligent-led, with financial crimes units going after the money supply, that they were able to squeeze the PCC and deal a real blow. But I think the challenge facing Brazil and Rio in particular right now is that organized crime and a CV have penetrated so deeply into state institutions and into the legal economy that this is a real problem from hell that needs to be dealt with. But it will not be resolved through hammer-like blows every 6 months or every year in a particular favela. All you're doing essentially is displacing the problem to other areas. These are franchises. They're built as franchises. So with every blow you have on one favela, it, like a balloon, grows in another community. And so we need these complex and comprehensive and integrated operations to be developed if we're going to have any meaningful impact on organized crime.
Thank you, Robert. It's been fascinating talking to you and getting the history and context of what's been going on. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
That's it for this week's episode of The Conversation Weekly. You can read more about the aftermath of the raid in Rio and the upcoming COP30 climate summit in Belém on the edge of the Amazon on theconversation.com. We'll put some links in our show notes to that. This episode was written and produced by Mend Marawani and me, Gemma Ware, with production assistance from Katie Flood. Thanks also go to Daniel Sticer, editor of The Conversation Brazil. Sound mixing is by Eleanor Brezzi, and our theme music is by Nita Saal. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can also sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience. If you like what we do, please support us at donate.theconversation.com, and please rate and review the podcast wherever you follow us. Thanks for listening.